1 Samuel 8, 4 to 20. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." But when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord. And the Lord told him, "Listen to all the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will do." Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "This is what the king who will reign over you will do. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your men servants and maid servants, and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, and the Lord will not answer you in that day." But the people refused to listen to Samuel. "No," they said, "we want a king over us. Then we shall be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles." And the second reading is Mark 3, 20 to 35. Then Jesus entered a house, and again a crowd gathered, so that he and his disciples were not even able to eat. When his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said, "He is out of his mind." And the teachers of the law who came down from Jerusalem said, "He is possessed by Beelzebub. By the prince of demons, he is driving out demons." So Jesus called them and spoke to them in parables. "How can Satan drive out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. If a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. And if Satan opposes himself and is divided, he cannot stand. His end has come. In fact, no one can enter a strong man's house and carry off his possessions unless he first ties up the strong man. Then he can rob the house. I tell you the truth, all the sins and blasphemies of men will be forgiven them. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will never be forgiven. He is guilty of an eternal sin." He said this because they were saying, "He has an evil spirit." Then Jesus' mother and brothers arrived. Standing outside, they sent someone in to call him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they told him, "Your mother and brothers are outside looking for you." "Who are my mother and my brothers?" he asked. Then he looked at those seated in a circle around him and said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother."
Thank you very much, Megan, for those readings. I've just noticed on my order of service, it doesn't say sermon anywhere, so I might just go and sit down again. But bad news, guys, there is a sermon. I wonder how you view the words from the first book of Samuel. Some of you know that I'm a bit of a fan of the Old Testament. Love it. But a lot of us are kind of missing the big picture. So one thing I found helpful to try and understand the big picture of the Old Testament period is think of 4 groups of 500 years. 4 Ps. There's a bit of poetic license in the use of the Ps here, as you'll see. The first 500 years, this is roughly 2000 BC to 1500 BC. That's the period of the patriarchs, starting with Abraham. Then you get the period of the prophets. We think of them as the judges. Then we get the period of the princes. That's the poetic license because it's the kings, really. And then we get the period of the priests, where they are the ones ruling Israel. So you've got patriarchs, you've got prophets, you've got princes, and you've got priests. And the bit we're reading, it's a key changeover event. It's a bridging event between the last of the prophets, Samuel, and the first of the princes. And we know, although it's not in this particular passage, we know it's going to be Saul, followed by David, followed by Solomon. So as a rough guide, that may help to sort of put things in their right places. I just noticed it there reading it. I never noticed it when I was preparing for this, which says something about my preparation. But when I saw it on screen now, I suddenly realised how insulting the comments to Samuel are. Well, you're an old man. I'm feeling that now. I get that from the kids at school. How old are you, sir? 800? It's not the fact they've insulted his age that gets Samuel annoyed. It's what they have asked for. They want a king. And there's a couple of reasons why they want a king. One we know about from the preceding chapters of Samuel. It's Samuel's own sons who he has appointed to be the next leaders of Israel. But they aren't like Dad. They do their own thing. They are corrupt. And the people recognize that and realize that and do not want to be led by them. But of course, they give us the other reason. They want a king like everybody else. Because when they look back to Egypt, Pharaoh was a mighty leader, and he led a huge army. And when they look around at other nations, they can measure the strength of those nations by the strength of their armies. The things that you can see. And that's what they want. It was said of Moses that it was far easier for him to get the Hebrews out of Egypt than it was to get Egypt out of the Hebrews, something he never managed to do. And we are so similar in that the things of this world are so much part of our DNA, part of who and what we are, that it influences our thinking, it influences our values, and it kind of tells us that if you haven't got these things, you have nothing. The theme for this sermon is about how we view things. Do we see things as God sees them? If you're into Shrek, it's like ogres and onions. It's all about layers. We see the outside. The people who went to Samuel demanding a new king, they were looking at the outside. And they saw the strength of those things. I was reminded this morning when I was walking, I usually go up the beacon, Western Beacon, and of course today was absolutely gorgeous, sun beating down. I'm thinking, there's got to be a barbecue in there somewhere, got to manage that before the end of the day. But then the dog, I noticed, was limping. We've got 2 dogs, golden retriever was limping. He's had a poorly paw. And as much as you try and put socks and boots and bandages on his poorly paw, he's not going to keep them on. And amidst the glorious morning that was up there today, there was a dog limping. And that just made me think, started my line of thinking, is that sometimes things just look amazing, they look wonderful, all looks good. But beneath the surface, in some of those layers that we don't see, people are limping. And often some people have got a very obvious limp that we can see. It might be a burden they carry or something. But a lot of people are carrying a burden, a limp that we don't see. God sees that. He sees it, every single one of us. You know, I've really got to do something about my opening prayers, I know that. But I just love reminding everybody that he knows us intimately. Every hair on our head is counted. He formed us out of the dust of the earth and put his breath into us. Something so intimate and hands-on about that. Not just spoken into existence like everything else. And he calls us by name. As we move forward to Mark's Gospel, we're only in chapter 3, but so much has happened. I just encourage you to just read it. You know, it'll only take you 10 minutes to read through events up to this point. Mark's Gospel is so action-packed. So much has happened. But it sets the scene. It is the context for the reading we have. And I would remind you that Mark does not mess around. In the very first sentence of his Gospel, the beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. He's nailing his colours to the mast right on line 1 of his book. That Jesus is not just a good teacher, as many have argued. He is God. His divinity is there. C.S. Lewis reminds us that we do not have the right to call this man anything other than either a very confused and disturbed liar or the Son of God. Because he himself makes extraordinary claims. But anyway, let's get to our context and our reading. Just before these events, there's been healings, there's been exorcisms, casting out of demons. People have been amazed, people have been awestruck. The people have travelled to see him. He has chosen the 12 disciples. There are crowds and crowds and crowds pressing in. And already we have the germs of the problem which is facing him, i.e. the religious authorities are already alert to him. And they've come out of Jerusalem all the way to his home area, Galilee, with the intention of catching him out. And they make this accusation which, in the modern age, just seems, it's hard for us to get our heads around it. He's doing these things by Satan, Beelzebub, the Lord of the Flies. They're suggesting there is something demonic about the power of Jesus. Notice they are not denying the miracles that he has performed, because the crowds have seen those. They have seen evil spirits respond to him and be driven out. But do they really see? For quite a few years now, we kept chickens. And originally, years and years ago, we just got 3 rescue hens from a battery farm. And it was just fascinating watching them realise that there's a big wide world out there and the freedom and something called sunlight and earth, things they'd never experienced. And over the years, we kind of kept 3 or 4 hens. And then middle daughter came back home and took an interest in the chickens. And she thought, why have 3 chickens when you can have 21? So it wasn't long before we had 21 chickens. And then she thought, why have 21 chickens when you can have ducks as well? So we got a couple of ducks, and then we had 7 ducks, strangely. And I have to say that we all, although we moaned about it as a time, because you kind of feel you have to as a parent, don't you? Do we have to have all this? It's a real, it was wonderful, it was blissful. And you see the character, particularly of the ducks, the character of the ducks compared to the chickens was just off the scale, something very comical about them. The chickens are just like little mini dinosaurs strutting around the place, and you get to know them. And she could tell you just by the egg who the mother was. And she had selected as many different chickens to get a whole rainbow spectrum of eggs, different colours as possible. And all was lovely until about 6 weeks ago. And she went down the garden to feed them and sort them out. And a fox had got in. Carnage, horrible. 7 ducks killed and a couple of hens. And, it was not nice. There was bits all over the place. And that came crashing in then, the reality of nature. That you can be out on a lovely sunny day like this and think everything is wonderful. But we live in a fallen world. And beneath the surface layers, nature is all, there's a nasty side to it. There's a life and death struggle going on. Just to pursue the duck story, one of the ducks had been a drake. And she realised on the day, it was like, all right, we're going to get rid of all of them. I'm not doing this. I can't go through that again. Let's get rid of the remaining hens. But within 24 hours, she'd come up with a strategy. We'll put 2 broody hens, she said, on the eggs that we think may be fertilised that the ducks had left. I didn't realise that fertilised duck eggs can stay fertilised for weeks. And you can eat them and you would never know. And if you put a broody hen on them, it turns out you get ducklings. So out of our carnage, we had 5 little ducklings. And we were all very excited about this and the whole process. So I put a little camera in the coop. That was a feat of engineering beyond all. Anyway, so the most watched thing in our house was duck cam. And these little ducklings arrived, all 5, and we were waking up in the middle of the night and putting the camera on just to have a look. And finally they hatch. And it was amazing. But then, in front of everybody, a jackdaw comes and grabs one. So we're down to 4. It is now jackdaw proof, I assure you. The point I'm making here is that is part of our world that goes on all the time. Now, if you're a farmer, if you're somebody who's close to nature and all of that, you will be very much aware of that life and death struggle that goes on all the time. For the majority of us, you buy your food at Tesco's or wherever, we totally miss what is going on in the real world all the time. I suspect if any of us spent any time in an abattoir seeing what went on there, we might become vegetarians. It's the real world, and we don't see it on the whole. The story we get here is talking about much deeper layers of the real world, about the spiritual forces that are arranged against us. It's no coincidence that by chapter 3 of his gospel, right at the beginning of his ministry, there is opposition to Jesus. It is not just because he's challenging the authority of the religious people. Satan knows who he is. The evil spirits recognize who he is. And they flee when he casts them out. The real world we live in isn't the sun-drenched vistas that we could see if you're walking up on the beacon this morning. That's part of it, of course it is, and we can enjoy that. But there is so much more going on in the spiritual realms, in the psychological realms. Some of us are walking with a limp and we don't see it. Others don't see it. But those are the layers that God sees. And like back in the days of Samuel, where people see things as the world sees things. To be a strong nation, you need a strong king with a strong army. And even when they are warned about the consequences, they say, it's what we want. Wasn't part of God's plan. And we know that at the end of Solomon's reign, the kingdom is split in two. Invasion happens to both the north and south. And the Hebrew people are devastated in a way that is so profound. God made it clear, it is me they have rejected as king. In the reading we had, there's so many things in there that each one kind of deserves its own series of things. We've got the unforgivable sin is mentioned, and I know many Christians kind of lose sleep over that. I'm afraid I have a very simplistic approach to sin, and I get it partly from C.S. Lewis at the end of The Last Battle, where he pictures the final judgment, and he shows all the creatures of Narnia racing down to the new country. And there's a big entrance to the new country. And he, Aslan the lion, stands at the door at one side. And those creatures that recognize Aslan go towards him. But some creatures looking fear and hatred, and they veer off into the shadows. And they don't enter the new country. The way I see heaven and hell, this might be controversial, so please feel free to challenge. God honors our choices. I teach my kids at school, God is lots of omnis. He's omniscient, he knows everything. He's omnibenevolent, he loves everybody. He's omnipresent, he is everywhere at once. And he is omnipotent. He is all-powerful. But that's not quite true, because there's one thing God cannot and will not do. And he will not override your free will. And if you reject God, and reject him, and reject him, and reject him, and reject him, at the end of time, he has to honor your choice. And that is the way I understand hell. It's a separation from God. And it's kind of our choice, far more than it is his. His heart is for everybody. And so that reference to the sin against the Holy Spirit, I would say that you have to have been rejecting God. You have to know that the Holy Spirit is the Holy Spirit. You can't just, stumble into this. You have to be rejecting. And you have to know what you're rejecting. That's the way I see it. Others may see that differently. I understand that. And feel free to throw buns at me afterwards if you have a particular position on that you would like me to consider, and I promise you I will. But then finally, to start wrapping things up, because I could go on forever, and I won't, we have his family, and I get so fascinated with the family of Jesus. Absolutely fascinated. I'm just going to focus on one of his brothers, James. And we often forget that Jesus has got brothers and sisters. We know that. I think it's Matthew's Gospel. Gives us the most information about them. But they are referred to here in Mark's. And they basically have come round to tell him to shut up and to go home. That's his mum and his brothers and sisters. He's embarrassing them. They still haven't quite got it. 3 years after this, Mary is going to be watching her son die on the cross. It is not until his brother James meets the risen Jesus that he gets it. James has spent 33 years. Well, I don't know how old James is. We don't know how old James is. So not 33 years. But James has spent his entire life with Big Brother, Jesus. He has known him throughout those years. He hasn't seen what's been right in front of him for all of those years until after the resurrection, he meets his brother. And you see a profound change. He describes himself after that event as a servant of Jesus Christ. Not, oh, I'm brother to Jesus, to get some kudos. He becomes the leader of the church at Jerusalem. And he is known for his humility. He'd got it wrong for all of that time. And it took the risen Jesus for him to have his eyes opened and to see things as they really are. Now, we struggle to see things as they really are. This book is the major thing we have, the major looking glass, if you like, which enables us to see things as God sees them. But that is just one part of what we need to be doing, getting into his word, sure, but spending time with him. Asking the awkward questions. I think it seems so often in church that we're very polite and nice and won't ask the questions that are really vexing us, really troubling us. I think God is big enough to deal with any question we can chuck at him. He hasn't got a problem with our doubts. He wants you to come to him with your doubts and to share them and be open to his response. Because I believe in a living God who responds to us when we come before him in prayer. When you read the Psalms of David, remember a man who'd committed adultery, who'd arranged a murder, who'd tried to cover that up, but also knew the utter depths of despair when he recognized his sin. Some of his psalms are not nice and polite to God. They are raging at him. Why do you allow the wicked to prosper? Why is it the good that suffer? He asks God plainly and bluntly to reveal some of the things that are hidden to us. Paul reminds us that we see through a glass darkly, but we see glimpses, and we are encouraged to get closer to God, to see things as he sees it.